In this episode, Origins of Design. Is the future of design merely a reflection of its past, or are we finally drawing on a blank canvas? Welcome to Two Architects and a Lawyer. Join architect Luis de Miguel in Valencia and architect-lawyer William McLean in Vancouver for observations and commentary on all things design. Here are William and Luis.
Well, Luis, great to talk to you as always. Welcome back. Today, we're digging into the origin of architecture and I hope design in general. And I wanted to say that you and I aren't academics. We are not claiming to be, so we have to be careful not to trip over our own shoelaces here. But you've told me that you're fascinated by the idea that humans originally copied nature closely just to produce a simple shelter. And that's probably a good place to start with our talk today.
Yeah. Well, a lot of things have to come into place when you think about, well, what was the first thing that one could call architecture or design for that matter? I suppose tools had to be designed to basically to hunt. So maybe that was the first original design. And of course, at the same time, they needed shelter. So both go together.
So we are still relying on the past when we carry out design today. Is that basically your proposition?
Well, I'm not sure that rely is the right word to use here. Inevitably, we're influenced by what came before, and we can either accept it, embrace it, enlarge it, or reject it outright.
Well, I think design is clearly some kind of combination of probably education, experience, observation, and practice. Every designer has those 3 or 4 things in mind, but why don't you get into the idea that humans copied nature and that's where it started?
Okay. Well, clearly the first shelter, the first human shelter were caves because it was very easy. There were natural caves, and then there were some other caves that they dug out themselves. So, in terms of shelter, the cave was the first housing, as it were. It's clear that the first buildings, if you want to call it, sturdy stone buildings, were designed by the Egyptians. And the Egyptians took it, obviously much further with these, fantastic columns, temples, and so on. And they were really the origin of what then became classical architecture in Greece and in Rome.
We've looked at a few images showing columns, post and beam, basically. That's something which does not exist in nature.
The Egyptians used columns, and these columns sort of reflected or remind one of things like papyrus or other plants. The idea of religion has existed from day one. So in order to house these concepts of religion, their buildings needed to be somewhat imposing. So yes, in nature, you don't find post and beam, but you do find the post, and you find a lot of posts. And in fact, these buildings, the Egyptian buildings, one of the problems was that they couldn't span very far. So they had a lot of columns. We have an example of that showing how crowded these columns were, and one of the problems was this. A technical problem was spanning. They couldn't span with stone very far. It was just, packed with, these buildings were packed with columns. Subsequently, you can see the 3 main pyramids in Egypt, which already were, they were pointing north and all this sort of thing very accurately. But my question to you is, can one consider these pyramids as architecture?
Are they architecture? I've been looking at images of the pyramids lately because I've been reading an excellent book called Fortunes of War, which takes place in part in Cairo. And many of the scenes take place in a hotel which overlooks the pyramids in the distance. And I've never seen them in person. I don't think you have either. I've often imagined what it would be like walking among them, whether I would be overwhelmed There are clearly massive, interesting examples of craft at the most ingenious. The reason why pyramids are foremost in our consciousness these days is because we're obsessed with trying to figure out how they did it. The stones had to be brought from the rivers at some distance away. They had to be hauled up along winding ramps, presumably. The other issue is the cladding of these pyramids. Apparently, they were dazzling in their original form when they were covered with smooth, polished limestone, and that's
Yeah.
an experience we will never get. So it's hard to understand them completely. Are they architecture? Well, I'm having trouble with the interface between architecture and craft, and I would have to say craft more than architecture. They're architecture in the sense that they provided shelter for a particular purpose, in this case of burial. And obviously the makers of these buildings were conscious that whatever they did, it was something that had to last for as long as possible. So they used their skills as builders to produce that result. But I don't know. The idea had to come from somewhere. And I suppose that is the glimmer of what we're calling design. What's your view on that?
Well, I have a hard time calling it architecture, frankly, because, like you say, it's shelter for one person and one dead person at that. There's no windows, there isn't a door. The whole point was that nobody, in fact, was welcome there. So it was just something to be admired from afar. And like you say, the limestone that was there made them shine. Can you imagine the sun hitting these things? And the thing is that this wasn't the only thing they built. They built a lot of temples in Luxor, all kinds of places down the Nile. So I think those were more buildings.
Let me just jump in on that. There's one of the things about the pyramids. I guess the principal thing is that they have survived. You showed an earlier image of a pyramid-like form which was not successful, as if it was an attempt at getting someplace, and it was later refined into what we think of as the Great Pyramid. But we're stuck living in the present with a collection of things which have survived from the past. But of course, not everything has survived. Experiments that failed didn't make it through to our present day.
Absolutely.
And we therefore look at the past in this kind of blindfolded way where we think that there was a steady evolution of increasing perfection and mastery of materials and so on. But in fact, it was trial and error, trial and error, trial and error. When they were building the Gothic cathedrals, they didn't completely understand why they were being held up properly by buttresses. The building's side walls got higher, the buttresses got thinner until they fell down, and they would retreat into a different design. And that took place over many centuries.
Yeah.
And the ones that were successful are the ones that survive, and we seem to accept them as being the paragons of achievement that they are, but we don't see the in-between stages. That's even more clear when you look at, you and I had an exchange of cave art at Altamira and other places. Where are the sketchbooks where these people learned how to draw those fabulous bison and change their mind?
If I can just butt in here, you don't have to go that far. You don't have to go 20,000 years to Altamira or some other cave. You can go back to the Romanesque or the Gothic period, where you hardly see any hardly any housing that survived. And one of the reasons, seems to me, is that obviously these churches were built in stone, and like the pyramids and like the temples, and the housing was built with wood. So clearly it couldn't survive. For the most part, hardly anything left. And not only that, but I mean, in terms of urban design, it's sort of, there was a tradition that happened in America that they built the cathedrals on top of the Mayan or Aztec temples, and you build sacred over sacred, and the rest is all just bulldozed, and you start from scratch.
It reminds me that for the purpose of trying to understand architectural history, we are inclined to divide that history into periods which we associate with stylistic movements and so on. And I know that you've been looking at that. Can you tell me your thoughts on whether it's useful to identify particular phases of architectural design as a stylistic period?
Yeah.
Does that help us understand the progress of
Yeah, of
design?
course. Yeah, of course. I'll just bring in Norman Foster just for the sake of argument. And he said that good architecture was the architecture that used the best technology. So the idea of the technology and how you put up a building and how you become sort of daring by their spans become greater and so on has to do with the technology and the best use of technology. So whereas both the Romans and the Greeks and the Egyptians didn't really have arches, which solve a lot of problems of span and so on. Apparently, the arches were developed somewhere in Mesopotamia. They were used for sewers and for civil type works and so on. And it was only the Etruscans who developed arches for structural purposes, for lack of a better word. Many of the ruins that you see in Greece and so on, one of the elements missing are roofs. And the reason that the roofs didn't survive is because the roofs were made with wood. So even though they had a pediment and a tablature and all these elements, behind that or beyond that was a wooden roof. And most of the Acropolis, for one, there's no roofs. And in Rome, there are no roofs. It's only the outside columns and then some tablatures and so on. So again, the technology has a lot to do with what we see now. But at least by pitching the roof, from pitching the roof to an arch, it's not a big step. And once you have the arch, then the world's your oyster, because arches liberate, they create openings that are much bigger than what they used to be and so on.
To that, I would say, I keep coming back to the real world here. When I say real world, I mean the modern world that we live in and function as designers. Does a designer in the real world actually think in these historical terms, or are we just inventing this to stay organized? I mean, how is this impinging on my brain as a designer working today?
All you have to do is go to Paris, France, and you'll see any kind of versions of like the Pantheon building, and certainly classical. We've gone back to classical architecture any number of times, many times, and even neo-Gothic. But for the most part, we're in love with these Corinthian columns, the entablature, the pediment, and all that. And we've gone back to that mainly because it was a damn good solution. I mean, they're fantastic buildings. I mean, these were magnificent spaces, magnificent buildings to begin with. And then beyond classical, once people got a little more money, they made it more ornate and more elaborate. And we call that Baroque, so the only thing that happened was that eventually, this classical Baroque stuff, and I'm going to East Germany, they came up with the Bauhaus, and the Bauhaus said basically less is more, no decoration, everything is just a straight line, and there's nothing little doodads here and there. So this brings you to this modern day stuff, which then again, history repeated itself even after the modernism was called the international style, because it sort of took over the whole architecture world. And yet, even after that, they still, they came back with this postmodern stuff, which was a sort of a caricature of classical architecture in my mind. And it didn't last very long. And so that was that. So yes, to answer your question, and I think the typeface that's stamped on the building, on the Pantheon building, the Agrippa, put this up in such a date, 25 BC, by the way, was what is still used today. Times Roman is a perfectly good example of legible type. No?
Well, you started this section by saying we are still in love with the Corinthian column, and now you're talking about Times Roman and so on. But of course, both graphic designers and architects both embrace and resist using these classical references. And, Gehry, to go back to that example, we seem to keep coming to him because he is such a disconnect from the past. Was he reacting against what we're seeing in this picture? Is it an attempt to divert people's attention from what they're comfortable with? Or was it because he was taking advantage of new materials, new structural techniques, new ways of envisioning design through computer graphics and computer-assisted design? Once you've got those tools, you can't help but use them. When the only tools you have are blocks of stone, a chisel, and a hammer, of course, buildings like the Pantheon are the ultimate expression of what you can do with those tools. There's no reason to continue to look at these examples of craft if you have to add to the mix the availability of a complete new set of tools and materials. If Agrippa had computer-aided design and titanium, obviously the Pantheon would not look like this.
Well, yeah, absolutely. I mean, you have a guy like Gaudi, for instance, who came up with all kinds of buildings that were all contorted and very smooth and sinuous and all kinds of stuff that nobody had ever done before. And he still did it with stone because that's all he had. I mean, so yeah, once you have access to new materials and new ways of designing, and particularly new ways of building, then of course, and if you're a genius, small little requirement. Because the reason I bring up the Bilbao is because it really is the only building I think of in recent memory where most people agree it's a hell of a building. I mean, it's an amazing building. It's the only building that can compete with the Pantheon in a nutshell, in my opinion. It's one thing that we have done as a modern society that is better than what came before.
But are you firmly persuaded of that? Are you not concerned, as I am, that in 50 years, let alone 100 or 200 or 500, Bilbao well, first of all, it will not be there. It does not have the ability to withstand time that the Pantheon has. We can be of no doubt about that. But even aside from that, do you not think stylistically we'll be embarrassed to look back at this period and think this is what entertained people or people thought was good? Maybe the human intellect has a capacity which is unlimited. But if it is limited, you have to shed things. And that's what I personally think is going on in the designer's mind. You shed things that, even though they were tremendously important in 1920, cease to have the same importance in 2026.
You can look at art, let's say. And art basically became a representation of nature, of individuals, keeping records of who the kings were and so on. And then this guy from Malaga decided that he wasn't going to do that. And one of the things he used to say all the time when he was criticized as to why his paintings were so ugly, he said, well, I'm not concerned. I'm concerned about doing something that nobody has done before. He said, and once you manage to do something that nobody has done before, of course, the next person that comes along is not worried about doing something new. He can pretty it up. He said, but I don't have time to pretty it up. I'm too busy coming up with something that nobody has ever seen. So yes, I think it's important to break with everything that has come before. I think that's the way to go. But likely,
just disregard the past. You're advocating that we disregard the past.
Well, I think we should not completely disregard the past, but not be slaves to it. We can't keep building things that look like Roman temples, as beautiful as they are. I think that we should express something or our buildings should look like something else, because they are sustainable, because they use new materials, because they have better workings inside, electrical, HVAC, safety, blah, blah. All this sort of stuff has an impact. And don't forget that, Picasso could paint whatever the hell he wanted, as long as he could afford the canvas. That was the only constraint. And whereas as architects, we have something called the client.
Well, right now you're getting into a topic which I think is a very interesting one, which is the role of education and design. Implicit in what you're saying is the idea that you be informed as a modern, currently practicing designer, that you be informed of what went on before. And that's why, of course, the syllabuses of architecture schools and design schools invariably include some reference to the past. There are history courses which take you back to the beginning of time and bring you to the forward moment, because there's a strong belief that without that knowledge, you can't carry on and produce something new and worthwhile. I don't know whether to buy that or not. It's a tried and true formula, but just as the thought experiment that we went through a few minutes ago about taking Agrippa into the modern age with computer design and titanium, if we go the other way and put Gehry back in Roman times, confronted with the possibility of the commission to design the Pantheon, but with the tools of the Mason that were available to him, would that personality, if you could bring the modern Gehry back to that time, how would he react? I think it's possible to imagine a world in which education of designers does not include an exhaustive survey of the past. Do you feel differently about that?
No, there's somebody very famous, I forget who, but somebody came up with the idea that those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it.
I'm going to suggest we call it a day. There's lots of fruitful topics to be discussed in a further episode. Let's put our heads together and work out what those should be and get to it next time. Thanks for the conversation. Look forward to doing it again soon.